Wealth is not being created in your life right now. It is being returned, and that changes everything. Because a gift can be debated, a blessing can be delayed, but restitution is different. Restitution means something was always yours, and heaven has decided the time for recovery has come. For longer than you realize, your life has been moving through a hidden divine audit, and every injustice, every delay, every betrayal, every closed door, every strange loss, every exhausting season where you gave more than you received, has been recorded with a precision no human system could ever match. What looked like struggle was never simple failure. What looked like lack was never proof that you were forgotten. What looked like another disappointment was often evidence being gathered in higher realms, building a case so complete that no sabotage could out-argue it, and no counterfeit narrative could erase it. The money approaching you is not luck, not random chance, not a lucky break that fell out of the sky because the universe was suddenly in a generous mood. It is back pay. It is restitution. It is a divine settlement issued after a long season in which your endurance, your integrity, and your unseen perseverance testified on your behalf when you had no language for what was happening. Your silence was never the sound of defeat. It was the sound of the case being closed in your favor. It was the stillness of heaven finalizing the verdict, while your enemies mistook your quiet for collapse. So before we go deeper, take this moment seriously. Like this video as your act of agreement with divine justice entering your timeline. Subscribe if you know your spirit has been led here for a reason, and you are ready to walk in a new season of abundance with wisdom. And comment 77 below as your energetic signature, your way of saying, I accept what is being released. I refuse to argue with my worth, and I am ready to receive what has already been written in my name. Because the divine audit is complete, and that means your life has been under spiritual examination far longer than you were ever told, with every detail observed, every imbalance measured, and every invisible theft documented, even while the outer world tried to convince you nothing meaningful was happening. There were seasons when it felt as though your reality had been placed under pressure with no explanation, as though you were moving through a corridor where every step forward demanded 3 sacrifices, where opportunities slipped away at the last second, where ideas you carried with sincerity somehow resurfaced in the hands of others, where relationships left you drained instead of nourished, and where finances seemed to evaporate with a strangeness that logic alone could not fully explain. But none of it was random, and that is the first truth you must let settle into your spirit. The Chosen One has not been wandering through a meaningless wilderness. The Chosen One has been living in an examination chamber where every setback became evidence, every betrayal became testimony, every delay became a timestamp, and every moment you refused to become bitter became proof that your character was real and not dependent on reward. The universe was documenting imbalance. It was recording theft, sabotage, exploitation, envy, manipulation, and the countless ways your energy was consumed by people and systems that benefited from your exhaustion while pretending your hardship was your fault. They said you were behind, but heaven saw how much you had been carrying. They said you were bad with money, but heaven saw how much pressure had been diverted into your field. They said you were too sensitive, too emotional, too affected, but heaven saw that your openness was being misused by people who could sense your value, even if they could not name it. There are times in the Chosen One's life when isolation arrives and feels like exile, when the phone grows quiet, the invitations disappear, the circle shrinks, and the soul starts asking dangerous questions about worth and belonging. But that isolation was not punishment, it was protection. It was spiritual witness protection, a sacred separation designed to preserve the purity of your frequency while the case was being built. You had to be pulled away from certain voices so your inner signal could be read clearly. You had to be removed from some environments so the contamination would stop long enough for heaven to get a clean measurement of who you were beneath all the interference. What felt like abandonment was often evidence preservation. What felt like being forgotten was often a season where heaven was making sure your signature remained unaltered by the static of envy, manipulation, and false attachment. And then something shifted. You may not have had words for it, but something in you became quieter in a new way. Perhaps there was a peace that came without external reason, a strange stillness that arrived even before your circumstances changed. Perhaps there was a severing, an inner snap, a moment when emotional ties that had defined you for years no longer had the same hold. Perhaps there was a sudden clarity about certain people, certain patterns, or even certain fears that used to dominate your thinking. That was not random either. That was the sign that the verdict had been finalized. That was the moment the inner court fell silent because judgment had already been rendered in your favor. This is why what is coming now must not be viewed as a bonus or a casual blessing. It is restitution with precision and purpose. It is not just that money is coming. It is that what was delayed, siphoned, blocked, or held back is being calculated and released according to a higher intelligence that loses nothing and forgets nothing. And once you understand that the audit is complete, you can finally understand why the next revelation matters so much. Because the system lied to you about pain, and the lie was one of its cleverest tricks. You were taught to think of pain as weakness, as liability, as proof something had gone wrong in your life or in your design. You were told that tears were wasted energy, that heartbreak was a private embarrassment, that disappointment should be hidden quickly, and that suffering was something to rush past before anyone noticed. But what if the opposite was true? What if your pain was not worthless at all? What if it was one of the most valuable assets you ever carried? Every betrayal was a deposit. Every abandonment was an investment. Every disappointment that forced you inward, every humiliation that stripped away a false dependency, every lonely night where you had to keep yourself breathing through faith alone, was not empty suffering. It was stored value. It was spiritual currency accruing in an account no human eye could access. This is why certain people worked so hard to invalidate your emotional reality. When they told you that you were too much, too dramatic, too tender, too affected, it was not always casual cruelty. On a deeper level, it was a tactic to disconnect you from the value of what you were carrying. If you believed your pain meant nothing, you would mishandle it. If you believed your suffering was trash, you would throw away gold. And many around you benefited from that confusion. Some people fed on your emotional energy. Some grew stronger in seasons when you grew weaker. Some built confidence on the back of your self-doubt. Some enjoyed the light of your presence while quietly resenting the source of it. Some drew from your attention, your forgiveness, your depth, your labor, your hope, and your emotional openness, while giving very little back that was clean, stable, or reciprocal. They may not have understood it consciously, but they benefited from your unresolved pain, because unresolved pain releases energy, and energy always attracts users. But here is the mystery they never understood. Your soul carries a rare alchemy. You were not built merely to endure suffering, you were built to transmute it. This is why what tried to destroy you became material for your becoming. This is why the heartbreak that should have hardened you deepened you instead. This is why the betrayal that should have made you cynical sharpened your discernment. This is why the grief that should have emptied you became, over time, a chamber of compassion and wisdom. The chosen one is a kind of spiritual refinery. Life may hand you crude pain, but your soul has the ability to process it into strength, insight, and value. That is your hidden wealth. That is why you were targeted. And that is why the payout is not symbolic. The coming abundance is the physical conversion of spiritual currency into tangible form. What accumulated in the unseen is now pressing into the seen. The tears were not lost. The years were not wasted. The loneliness was not barren. You were accumulating. You were carrying a balance that could only be understood once the alchemy was complete. And that is why recalibrating the wealth frequency had to happen before this release could safely enter your life. Because if abundance had arrived too early, before the transformation within you was finished, it would not have liberated you. It would have endangered you. There was a time when more money would have drawn more parasites. There was a time when sudden abundance would have amplified guilt, obligation, fear, and old survival patterns. There was a time when you were still surrounded by people who would have interpreted your increase as access to your energy rather than confirmation of your destiny. Had the money come then, it could have become bait, a golden cage, a brighter stage for the same old drains. So the season of lack was not mere denial. It was divine quarantine. It was a firewall. It was a period in which heaven refused to place treasure in an unprotected field. You were being trained in sovereignty. You were being taught to locate your source above jobs, above approval, above temporary circumstances, above the fragile architecture of systems that collapse whenever fear enters the room. True wealth had to be installed in you before material wealth could be trusted with you. And true wealth begins as inner order. It begins as discernment sharp enough to recognize manipulation before it enters your house. It begins as peace that does not beg the outer world for permission to exist. It begins as stability that is not destroyed by temporary lack. It begins as alignment so deep that even in uncertainty, there is a quiet current of knowing underneath your fear. That is what was being built. The old operating system within you, the one trained by fear, guilt, urgency, people-pleasing, self-doubt, and chronic vigilance, had to be dismantled. That system could survive, but it could not steward abundance. It was always bracing, always shrinking, always scanning for danger, always over-explaining, always preparing to lose what it had barely received. So heaven began a deeper work. A new inner operating system was installed, rooted not in obligation, but in divine alignment. It came with discernment that detects falsehood faster. It came with boundaries that no longer feel cruel when they are necessary. It came with a steadier nervous system, a cleaner intuition, a reduced appetite for chaos, and a growing disinterest in proving yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. It came with the ability to sit in silence without collapsing into panic. It came with a more sovereign relationship to time, money, relationships, and energy. In simple terms, you became less available to corruption, and that is when wealth could begin to approach without threatening your soul. Because now, you are not just someone who wants money, you are someone becoming able to sustain it without being consumed by it. The frequency has changed. In the past, money may have activated anxiety, shame, pressure, or the feeling that everyone suddenly wanted a piece of you. Now a new wealth frequency is being formed, one that is attuned to peace rather than panic. This wealth is not coming to own you, it is coming to serve your mission. It is arriving to a field that is more ordered, more discerning, more aligned, more difficult to manipulate. You are no longer vibrating at the frequency of chronic extraction. You are no longer a match for constant loss disguised as normal life. You are becoming someone whose abundance will be less dramatic and more sovereign, less performative and more protected, less chaotic and more deeply anchored. And when that happens, another law begins to reveal itself. Because as your field becomes more ordered and more abundant, the collapse begins elsewhere, specifically in the lives of those who benefited from your depletion. As abundance rises for the chosen one, the karmic debtors begin to feel the tremor. This is one of the hardest truths for gentle souls to accept, because you do not always want to believe that collapse can coexist with your increase. But balance is balance. If others built comfort on manipulation, theft, sabotage, envy, or the steady consumption of your energy, then the closing of that access point creates consequences for them. Their downfall is not necessarily theatrical at first. It may begin as moral bankruptcy, emotional instability, spiritual dryness, the cracking of charm, the weakening of influence, the strange failure of strategies that once worked effortlessly. Masks begin to slip. Social circles grow colder. Confidence that once seemed magnetic starts to feel hollow. The people who thrived while feeding from your field may find that their lives become strangely difficult to manage once the cord is cut. Their relationships may weaken because stolen light never holds structure for long. Their finances may wobble because what looked like skill was often sustained by unauthorized access to energy that was never theirs. Their moods may darken because the supply they quietly depended on has been interrupted. And the most unsettling part for them will be that they may not fully understand why everything is suddenly harder. That is the nature of karmic debt. The bill arrives with exact timing, even when the debtor still thinks the old tricks should work. The facade begins to crack. The social performance becomes harder to maintain, Their confidence fades at the edges. What once looked smooth starts looking forced, and some of them, sensing unconsciously that the old power source has been cut off, may attempt to return. This is where many chosen ones are tested. Do not expect these returns to always come wearing obvious malice. They may come dressed as nostalgia, remorse, concern, apology, curiosity, or a strangely timed message that seems gentle on the surface. But discernment must lead here. Some returns are not repentance, they are hunger. They do not come because the person has truly changed. They come because your field has changed and they can feel it. They sense that something is moving in your life, and like moths to a lamp, they drift toward what they once had access to. This is why you must not interfere with the balancing of the books. Do not rescue, do not reconnect out of guilt. Do not volunteer your peace to people who only seek renewed access. Do not confuse compassion with re-entry. Divine neutrality is your instruction now. Let the universe handle its own accounting. Let consequences do their work without your interruption. You are not required to become the emotional emergency room for people whose choices are finally returning to them. You are not called to reattach yourself to collapsing structures out of pity. Their unravelling is not your revenge, and it is not your responsibility. It is the natural consequence of imbalance meeting correction. Stay clear, stay grounded, stay soft where softness is wise, and firm where firmness is holy. Because while the old networks weaken, your field is being cleared for a new order, and the quickest way to delay what is coming is to plug yourself back into a grid that heaven has already shut down. So keep moving forward with sober peace. The books are being balanced, the verdict has been issued, the tide is turning, and what is rising in your life now is not random fortune, but the precise return of what should have reached you long ago. And because the old channels were never designed to honour what is sacred, the next phase of your increase cannot be understood through ordinary logic, which is why the untraceable blueprint of prosperity now begins to reveal itself as something far greater than a normal financial opportunity, a salary increase, or a predictable reward from the same system that once overlooked, delayed, and misread you. The wealth that is coming is not limited to the routes the world taught you to obsess over. It is not confined to the small map that fear handed you when it told you money only comes through exhaustion, begging, hustling, approval, or conformity. What is approaching your life follows a divine blueprint, and divine blueprints do not ask permission from human planning before they unfold. They move through realities hidden from the logical mind. They arrive through channels that bypass gatekeepers, sidestep manipulation, ignore false timelines, and enter by routes so precise that when it happens, you will realize the world never had final authority over your provision. This is why some of what comes next may feel miraculous, not because it defies truth, but because it defies the narrow version of truth people were trained to accept. There are seasons when blessings are delayed, not because they were denied, but because they were time-locked. There are answers assigned to specific versions of you, inheritances meant for a healed nervous system, opportunities reserved for the self that no longer bargains away its value, and doors that could not open while old patterns still had access to your mind, your energy, or your sense of identity. Some prosperity has been waiting behind blocked timelines, standing quietly at the edge of your life until your frequency matched the life it was meant to serve. Some of it has been held back from earlier seasons because the old you would have interpreted it through fear, distributed it through guilt, or exposed it to people who would have weaponized your generosity. But now the atmosphere has changed, and what belongs to you can begin to travel. This is why you must expand your imagination about how provision arrives. It may come through an inheritance nobody mentioned, because heaven knows how to use forgotten branches of a family line. It may come through an old account, a lost asset, a settlement, a document, a refund, a matured investment, a missed payment returning with interest, or a resource you overlooked because its value was hidden until the appointed time. It may arrive through an idea you nearly discarded years ago, one that suddenly returns to your mind with a strange force and begins attracting the exact support it needed all along. It may come through creative work once ignored and now recognized. It may come through a connection that appears ordinary but unlocks a chain of events impossible to manufacture by force. It may come through a rare find, a rediscovered object, a forgotten wallet, a piece of property, a brilliant solution, a letter in the mail, or a divinely timed introduction that shifts the architecture of your finances in one conversation. This is the holy wildness of untraceable prosperity. It does not mock preparation, but it does surpass prediction. It is above the small mathematics of fear. The chosen one must understand this deeply, because if you keep demanding that provision look ordinary before you permit yourself to believe in it, you may miss the miracle while staring at the wrong doorway. Heaven often uses hidden routes precisely because visible routes were compromised. When systems were set against you, when people watched your movement too closely, when envy attached itself to your progress, when your confidence was too fragile to withstand public pressure, the blessing had to travel in silence. It had to move beneath radar. It had to be protected from premature exposure. This is why some prosperity feels as though it comes out of nowhere, even though in truth it has been moving toward you for a very long time. The route was hidden, not the assignment. The timing was guarded, not the promise. And now, because these routes are opening, your intuition becomes sacred infrastructure. Your dreams, nudges, flashes of clarity, and quiet inner instructions are no longer side notes. They are coordinates. They are the subtle language through which the blueprint communicates with your conscious mind. You may feel sudden pulls towards certain places, certain conversations, certain decisions that do not carry panic, only a calm knowing. That difference matters. Anxiety shouts and spirals. Guidance often arrives quietly, like a clean sentence dropped into still water. You may wake from a dream with a name, a location, an idea, or a memory that feels charged with unusual importance. You may feel compelled to search through an old drawer, revisit an abandoned project, call someone you have not spoken to in years, check a document, finish something you once left incomplete, or go somewhere without being able to fully explain why. These are not always random impulses. Sometimes they are instructions from a deeper intelligence that already sees the route before you do. Trust must mature here. Not blind impulsiveness, but sacred responsiveness. You are learning to honor the quiet guidance that does not need drama to be real. The mind may protest because it prefers visible guarantees, but the blueprint was never made for the mind alone. It was made for the soul, and the soul recognizes direction long before the body sees the destination. This is why your task in this season is not frantic striving, but calm attentiveness. Listen more carefully. Dismiss less quickly. Follow what is clear and quiet. There is prosperity with your name on it, moving through unseen corridors, and your inner guidance is one of the ways heaven teaches you how to meet it. And once it begins to arrive, another truth becomes essential, because this money is not merely a comfort package for the wounded, it is your new assignment. And sovereign stewardship is the language through which your abundance becomes stable, protected, and meaningful. You are not being brought into increase simply to prove something to the world, indulge every fantasy of escape, or numb yourself with luxury after years of lack. Relief may come, yes. Beauty may come, yes. Rest may come, yes. But none of those are the highest purpose of what is entering your life. This money carries mission inside it. It is provision, armor, and empowerment for your true calling. It is being released not only to free you from survival, but to free your deeper work from delay. For too long, your destiny has had to breathe through narrow spaces, interrupted by bills, exhaustion, instability, and environments that forced your energy toward mere maintenance. But sovereign stewardship means that now the flow changes. The money does not merely come to you, it also comes through you. Not in the sense of self-sacrifice or losing yourself again, but in the sense of alignment. Wealth in the hands of a chosen one is not meant to stagnate into vanity. It is meant to become organized blessing. It is meant to create room for truth, healing, beauty, justice, and structures that reflect integrity rather than exploitation. That begins, however, with your first responsibility, which is not grand public mission, but foundational peace. Secure your health, secure your housing, secure your body, secure your nervous system, secure your rest. Secure your freedom from chronic survival stress. Pay what must be paid, repair what must be repaired. Create an environment in which your soul can breathe without constant threat. This is not selfishness, this is strategy. A life still drowning in emergency cannot clearly hear the next instruction. A chosen one, constantly destabilized by survival, cannot steward a larger assignment with precision. Heaven is not asking you to neglect yourself in the name of purpose. Heaven is teaching you that your peace is part of the mission. Your stability is part of the mission. Your restored body is part of the mission. Your sanctuary is part of the mission. Once that base is secured, the larger field of stewardship begins to open. For some, this wealth will become seed capital for ethical businesses built without the old poisons of greed, manipulation, and soulless extraction. For some, it will fund creative work, media, music, education, writing, or art that helps people remember themselves in a world designed to keep them numb. For some, it will support communities, homes, healing spaces, training centers, learning environments, or quiet refuge for people who have been misread and worn down by corrupt systems. For others, it will lead to investing in new structures, technologies, land, networks, or collaborative ventures that reflect integrity instead of predation. The form will vary, but the principle remains the same. Your abundance is being entrusted to someone who has already learned the cost of imbalance, someone who knows what it means to live without enough, someone who has felt how damaging it is when energy is extracted without honor. This is why chosen ones are often trained so painfully before stewardship arrives. They have to know the difference between ownership and guardianship. Sovereign stewardship does not mean clinging nervously to wealth as though it defines your worth, nor does it mean letting guilt pressure you into giving it away without wisdom. It means you become a conscious director of what flows into your field. You decide from alignment, not coercion. You say yes from clarity, not from fear of being judged. You say no when something is misaligned, even if it wears emotional language to get past your boundaries. You learn to manage resources in a way that reflects both compassion and discernment. You become difficult to manipulate precisely because your generosity is no longer unconscious. It is governed, it is ordered, it is sovereign. And as you take your place in that kind of stewardship, you begin to attract aligned collaborators, soul-level allies, and people whose gifts resonate with your own mission. This matters because chosen ones are often trained in isolation and then mistakenly assume the mission must be carried alone. But no, isolation refined you. It was never meant to be your permanent strategy. There are allies assigned to your path, not random people drawn only by your resources, but true collaborators whose presence feels clean, whose timing feels natural, and whose energy does not create confusion in your spirit. You will recognize them not by performance, but by coherence. Things align around them rather than fracture. Your nervous system does not collapse around them. There is resonance rather than static. Their gifts complement rather than compete. Their presence strengthens rather than siphons. These are the kind of people who will help build what your calling was always meant to become, once survival was no longer consuming all your strength. So do not fear this next level of responsibility. You are not being handed wealth without preparation. You are being entrusted with what your soul has been trained to carry. The years of lack taught you value. The years of betrayal taught you discernment. The years of pressure taught you endurance. The years of silence taught you how to hear what matters. Nothing was wasted. It all prepared your hands to hold more without losing yourself. And when that stewardship begins to take visible form, the final verdict starts to manifest in a way even the outer world cannot ignore. Because wealth as vindication is not merely about money in an account. It is the universe's public ruling in your favor after years of being judged by evidence that never told the whole truth. There was a time when people looked at your life and drew conclusions based on surface. They saw delays and called you incapable. They saw empty bank balances and called you irresponsible. They saw your difficult path and called you unstable. They saw your unconventional choices and called you unrealistic. They saw your quietness and assumed defeat. They saw your refusal to move like everyone else and assumed confusion. In the court of public misunderstanding, appearances were entered as evidence against you, again and again. And because the world is often hypnotized by visible outcomes, many people felt justified in their judgments. They used your seasons of lack as proof that their shallow interpretations were correct. They acted as though struggle itself was the verdict, as though temporary hardship could define eternal value, as though the absence of visible success meant the absence of divine favor. But now the ruling changes. The incoming abundance becomes evidence that the old judgments were false. It becomes impossible, tangible contradiction. It becomes the material witness that your faith was not foolish, your path was not delusion, your slowness was not failure, and your unseen preparation was not emptiness. This is why the vindication runs deeper than money itself. The money matters, yes, but what it symbolizes cuts farther. It says, the story told about you was incomplete. It says the interpretations made in ignorance were never final. It says that heaven had evidence the world could not see. It says that while others were busy reducing your life to appearances, a higher intelligence was reading your perseverance, your restraint, your integrity, your healing, your endurance, and your refusal to collapse into bitterness. The chosen one must be careful here, because vindication can tempt the wounded ego to perform revenge, to fantasize about being seen by those who once dismissed you, to quietly crave their shock, their jealousy, their admission that they were wrong. But the deeper gift of vindication is not that they finally approve. It is that you no longer require their approval to know what is true. That is the real release. Abundance becomes public evidence, yes, but it also becomes inner closure. You stop needing apologies from people who could never have understood your path from where they stood. You stop waiting for validation from those who only knew how to measure life through limited metrics. You stop negotiating your identity with minds that mistook delay for denial. Their opinions lose heat. Their voices lose weight. Their narratives fade into the background like a broken radio in another room. Because once the verdict becomes visible, something settles in your spirit that no outer reaction can disturb. You realize you were never truly on trial before them. You were simply moving through a process they were not equipped to interpret. And now your peace, your freedom, and your success speak louder than any accusation ever could. You do not need to argue. You do not need to announce. You do not need to defend your journey line by line to people committed to misunderstanding it. The evidence now lives in your reality. The order in your nervous system is evidence. The restored dignity in your presence is evidence. The opportunities arriving with unusual precision are evidence. The money itself is evidence. The way you no longer scramble for belonging in toxic spaces is evidence. The way you can say no without guilt is evidence. The way your life begins to reflect coherence rather than chronic extraction is evidence. This is vindication in its mature form. Not noise, not boasting, not bitter triumph, but undeniable embodiment. And that is why the whole message must now come together with clarity, because none of your struggle was meaningless, none of it was outside the sight of heaven, and none of it disappeared into emptiness. Every hardship was recorded, every theft was seen, every act of perseverance built the case for divine restitution, even when you did not know you were testifying. The money approaching your life is not random luck, not a lucky turn, not an emotional fantasy to soothe disappointment. It is a precise spiritual settlement tied to your endurance, your transformation, your integrity, and the hidden labor of becoming someone able to carry more without betraying yourself. This is not only financial breakthrough, it is energetic liberation. It is soul vindication. It is the closing of an old cycle whose lessons were harsh but holy. The era of survival is ending. The era of abundance, purpose, and sovereignty has begun. Read that again in your spirit until it feels less like hope and more like recognition. The era of survival is ending. The era of abundance, purpose, and sovereignty has begun. You are no longer living as a defendant beneath the projections of others, no longer moving through life as if your worth depends on visible approval, no longer begging broken systems to tell you who you are. You are no longer on trial. You have become living evidence of divine justice. And when a chosen one reaches that point, The money is only one part of the miracle. The greater miracle is that the soul who once endured in silence now stands in a field of truth so solid that nothing false can define them again.